The sound of a single gunshot echoed across the foothills of the Wyoming territory, sending a flock of starlings into the air as Harriet Grayson stood frozen at her husband's freshly dug grave. The year was 1878, and at 24 years old, she was now a widow in a land that devoured the unprepared. Harriet brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face as the late autumn wind whipped across the small cemetery on the outskirts of Willow Creek. The pneumonia had taken James too quickly. One week he'd been breaking horses at their small ranch, and the next he was burning with fever, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. Now she stood alone, her black mourning dress collecting dust from the trail as the last of the townspeople departed, leaving her to her grief. "Mrs. Grayson," Sheriff Mills said gently, his weathered hand touching her elbow. "The stage is leaving. You shouldn't stay out here alone." "I'll walk back," Harriet replied, her voice hollow like a dried creek bed. "I need the air." The sheriff nodded reluctantly, mounting his horse. "The banker wants to speak with you tomorrow about the ranch," he added carefully. "Says there are some matters that need attending." Harriet didn't respond. She knew what those matters were. James had taken loans to expand their modest ranch, and now the bank would come calling. With no husband and no money, everyone expected her to sell and return east to her family in Boston, a place she'd left 5 years ago with dreams of adventure and love. The walk back to her ranch was nearly 3 miles, but Harriet barely noticed the distance. The mountains stood silent sentinels as the sun began its descent. Her boots kicked up dust from the trail, and she wondered how many footsteps it would take to walk away from grief. When she arrived at the small ranch house, the emptiness hit her anew. The horses nickered from the corral, reminding her they needed feeding. James had hired 2 ranch hands, but they'd already moved on, sensing the inevitable. Harriet had a week's worth of food, $63 hidden in a tin beneath the floorboard, and a heart that felt like it had been scooped out with a dull spoon. She fed the horses mechanically, her body remembering the motions while her mind drifted elsewhere. Inside the cabin, she lit a single lamp and sat at the rough-hewn table, staring at nothing. The silence pressed against her ears until she thought she might scream just to hear something other than her own breath. Morning came with unwelcome brightness. Harriet had slept in her clothes, curled on top of the quilt rather than beneath it. The banker would be expecting her, but first, she needed to decide what to do with the 6 horses in the corral. James had been training them to sell, but she couldn't finish the job herself. A knock at the door startled her. It was too early for visitors, especially out this far. When she opened the door, a tall man stood on her porch, hat in hand. The rising sun cast his face in shadow, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened with stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Mrs. Grayson?" His voice was deep, with the lazy drawl of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "I'm Thomas Garrett. Your husband hired me 3 weeks back to help with breaking horses. I was up north delivering a string to Fort Laramie." Harriet stared at him, trying to recall if James had mentioned hiring another hand. The days before his illness blurred together. "I didn't know he'd hired anyone else," she said finally. "Got his letter and payment just before I left. Said to report first week of October." Thomas Garrett shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "I heard in town about what happened. I'm mighty sorry for your loss, madam." Harriet's throat tightened. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett, but I'm afraid I can't honor whatever arrangement you had with my husband. I'll be selling the ranch." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze drifting past her to the corral. "Those horses still need breaking before you can sell them proper. No one will pay fair value for unbroken stock." He was right, and the knowledge irritated her. "I don't have money to pay you. I've already been paid for 2 months' work," he said simply. "Seems only fair I do what I was hired for." Harriet studied him more carefully. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His clothes were clean but worn, and the lines around his eyes suggested he was in his early 30s. Everything about him radiated competence and an easy confidence that Harriet had once possessed herself. "I'm heading into town now to speak with the banker," she said, not quite agreeing to his offer. "You can get settled in the bunkhouse if you're determined to stay." Thomas replaced his hat with a nod. "I'll see to the horses." As Harriet changed into her one decent dress, she listened to the sounds of Thomas moving around outside the creak of the pump as he drew water, the soft murmur as he spoke to the horses. It was strange having another person on the property after days of solitude. The meeting with the banker went exactly as she'd expected. Mr. Wilcox, a small man with spectacles and ambition, explained that she owed $300 with interest mounting daily. He offered to buy the ranch for exactly that amount, which they both knew was less than half its worth. "I need time," Harriet said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The horses need to be broken and sold first." Wilcox's mouth thinned. "You have until the first frost, Mrs. Grayson. That's all the time I can give you." The first frost typically came in mid-November, giving her 6 weeks at most. It wasn't enough time, but it was better than nothing. When she returned to the ranch, she found Thomas in the corral, working with a spirited buckskin gelding. He moved with the easy grace of someone who understood horses, never rushing but never hesitating either. The gelding was suspicious but not frightened, circling Thomas as he held out his hand, speaking in that same low, steady voice. Harriet watched from the fence, remembering how James had worked with horses, always impatient, always in a hurry. Thomas's method was different, quieter somehow. When the buckskin finally stretched out its neck and sniffed his palm, Thomas didn't move to catch him, but simply stood there, allowing the horse to make its choice. "The banker gave me until first frost," Harriet said when Thomas finally noticed her. "Can you have them ready by then?" Thomas straightened, considering. "It's tight, but if the weather holds and they've got decent temperaments, I can do it." "And what do you want in return?" 10% of the sale," he said without hesitation. "Fair price for my time." It was reasonable, better than reasonable. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Garrett? You could find steady work elsewhere." Something passed across his face, too quick to interpret. "I gave my word to your husband. That means something where I come from." That night, Harriet cooked a proper meal for the first time since James had fallen ill. Thomas ate at the small table in the bunkhouse, declining her invitation to join her in the main house. The distance was appropriate, but somehow made her feel even more isolated. As days passed, Thomas fell into a rhythm. He woke before dawn, did chores around the ranch that Harriet hadn't been able to manage alone, then spent the rest of the day with the horses. By the end of the first week, he had the buckskin accepting a saddle without protest. Harriet found herself watching him more than she should. There was something about his methodical approach that drew her, the way his hands moved confidently, but never roughly, the patience in his posture as he waited for a horse to come to terms with something new. It reminded her of herself before grief had hollowed her out, when she'd approached life with careful determination instead of numbness. "You're good with them," she said one evening as Thomas checked the buckskin's hooves for stones. "They just need someone to be steady," he replied, not looking up. "Horses can feel when you're uncertain or afraid. They need to know you won't lead them into danger. Is that why you're so quiet?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Thomas glanced up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Never saw much point in talking just to hear my own voice." "James talked all the time," Harriet said, looking away. "He filled every silence with plans and dreams." Thomas straightened, releasing the horse's hoof. "Different men have different ways," he said simply. "Doesn't make either right or wrong." The next day, rain kept Thomas from working with the horses, so he turned his attention to the leaking roof of the main house. Harriet found herself uncomfortably aware of his presence as he moved overhead, the sound of his boots on the shingles a constant reminder that she was no longer alone. When he came down for the noon meal, his shirt was damp with rain and sweat, clinging to the planes of his chest. Harriet busied herself with cutting bread, trying not to notice. "Should hold now," Thomas said, accepting the plate she offered. "Found where the water was getting in." "Thank you." Harriet sat across from him, her own plate untouched. "The banker came by while you were up there. He's found a buyer for the ranch." Thomas chewed slowly, his expression neutral. "Before or after the horses?" "After. But it means I'll definitely be leaving once they're sold." Saying it aloud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Despite everything, this small ranch had been her home, the only place she'd ever felt truly herself. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully casual. "Back east, I suppose. My parents are still in Boston." The thought filled her with dread. They'd warned her against marrying James, against coming west. Returning would mean admitting they'd been right. "That what you want?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted since James died. They'd all assumed she would, of course, return to civilization where a proper widow belonged. I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted. Everything I planned was with James. Thomas nodded, as if her answer made perfect sense. No rush to decide. Still got those horses to sell first. As October deepened, the work continued. Thomas broke the horses one by one, each with the same patient approach. The buckskin was nearly finished, responding to subtle cues from the reins. A paint mare showed promise as a cutting horse. The other four were coming along at various paces. Harriet began accompanying Thomas to town when he took the horses for short rides along busier trails, accustoming them to distractions. She rode the buckskin, surprised by how responsive he was. Thomas had trained him beautifully. You sit a horse well, Thomas observed on one such ride. Most Eastern ladies don't. I wasn't always Eastern, Harriet replied. My father was a cavalry officer before he went into banking. I learned to ride almost before I could walk. Thomas looked at her with new interest. That explains why you ended up out here. Got the West in your blood. The observation stirred something in Harriet, a reminder of who she'd been before, adventurous, determined, alive. The numbness that had enveloped her since James's death receded slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. That evening, Thomas built a fire outside, and they sat beneath the stars, planning the upcoming horse sale. Harriet had written advertisements for the territorial newspaper and sent letters to ranchers who might be interested. The buckskin would be ready to show within days. We should name them, Harriet said suddenly. No one wants to buy a horse without a name. Thomas looked surprised but nodded. Makes sense. What do you reckon for the buckskin? Harriet studied the gelding grazing nearby. Sovereign, she decided. He carries himself like he knows his worth. Thomas's mouth curved in a small smile. Sovereign it is. They named the others together. The paint mare became Calico, a sturdy bay gelding became Titan, a leggy chestnut they called Copper, a dappled gray named Sterling, and a small black gelding with a white blaze they christened Bandit. The simple act of naming felt strangely intimate, as if they were creating something together. As the stars wheeled overhead, Harriet found herself telling Thomas about meeting James at a Boston social, how his wild tales of the West had captivated her, how they'd eloped against her parents' wishes. Thomas listened, his silence an invitation rather than a barrier. He promised adventure, she said softly, and he delivered it. I don't regret coming west, even with how it ended. What adventures did you have? Thomas asked, his voice gentle in the darkness. Harriet realized with a start that there hadn't been many. There had been the journey west, certainly, and the challenges of establishing the ranch. But James had spent most of his time chasing bigger dreams while she managed the day-to-day realities. I suppose the adventure was the life itself, she said finally. Learning to live on our own terms, away from society's expectations. Thomas nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. That's no small thing. The next morning, the first potential buyer arrived to see Sovereign. Thomas put the buckskin through his paces while Harriet watched nervously. The buyer, a rancher from 20 miles south, seemed impressed. He's steady, the man observed. Mind if I try him? Thomas handed over the reins, and Harriet held her breath as the rancher mounted. Sovereign responded beautifully, turning and stopping with minimal guidance. I'll give you $70, the rancher offered. Harriet knew Thomas had valued Sovereign at closer to 90, but 70 was still a good price. She looked to Thomas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. 75, and he's yours, she countered. The rancher considered, then agreed. As he counted out the money, Harriet felt a surprising pang at the thought of Sovereign leaving. She'd grown attached to the buckskin over the past weeks. You did well, Thomas said as they watched the rancher ride away. That's a fair price. It feels strange, selling him, Harriet admitted. That's the business, Thomas replied, but his tone was gentle. Can't keep them all. Over the next 2 weeks, they sold 4 more horses. Calico went to a cattle baron's daughter who fell in love with the mare's distinctive markings. Titan and Copper were purchased by a stagecoach company looking for reliable team horses. Sterling attracted interest from several buyers before going to a doctor who needed a horse with a smooth gait for his rounds. Only Bandit remained, the smallest of the lot, but with a clever disposition that Harriet had grown particularly fond of. With 5 horses sold, She had enough to pay off the bank loan with a small sum left over enough for a train ticket east and perhaps a month's lodging while she found work. The night after Sterling's sale, Harriet found Thomas sitting on the porch steps, staring at the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. The first hints of frost had appeared that morning, delicate white crystals melting as soon as the sun touched them. Winter was coming. "We did it," she said, sitting beside him. "The bank is paid, and I have enough to start over." Thomas nodded, still looking at the mountains. "You decided where that'll be yet?" Harriet sighed, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My parents expect me in Boston. They've already written about potential positions as a companion or governess for families in their circle." "That what you want?" Thomas asked again, the same question he'd posed weeks earlier. This time, Harriet had an answer. "No, but I'm not sure what the alternative is." Thomas turned to face her, his expression unusually open. "There's a small spread for sale near Medicine Bow. Nothing fancy, 2-room cabin, decent grazing, good water. Owner's heading to Oregon. Asking $300. Harriet stared at him, confused. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're good with horses," he said simply. "And you don't talk about Boston like it's home." "I can't run a ranch alone," Harriet protested. "That's why I'm selling this one." "You wouldn't be alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Harriet's heart stuttered. "What are you saying, Mr. Garrett?" "Thomas," he corrected gently. "And I'm saying I'd like to go partners on that spread." "Business arrangement," he added quickly. "To start, anyway." To start. The implication was clear. Harriet looked away, overwhelmed by the possibility he was offering not just a business partnership, but potentially something more, something that could grow over time. "I barely know you," she whispered. "You know the important parts," Thomas replied. "You've seen how I work, how I treat animals. Rest comes with time." Harriet stood abruptly, needing space to think. "I need to consider it." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here until Bandit sells." That night, Harriet couldn't sleep. She paced the small house, thinking about Thomas's offer. It wasn't romantic, he was too respectful for that, especially given her recent widowhood. But it was practical, and somehow more appealing than any flowery declaration could have been. In the morning, frost covered the ground again, lasting longer this time before the sun melted it away. Harriet watched Thomas work with Bandit, putting him through more advanced paces. The little horse was turning out to be the most versatile of the lot, quick, intelligent, and willing. "What if we don't sell him?" Harriet called from the fence. Thomas looked over, brows raised in question. "Bandit," she clarified. "What if we keep him? For the new place." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, transforming his features. "That mean you're considering my offer?" "I'm considering it," Harriet confirmed, her own lips curving upward. 2 days later, they rode to Medicine Bow to see the property. It was smaller than her current ranch, but the land was good, with a year-round creek running through it. The cabin was rough but solid, with space enough for 2 people who didn't mind close quarters. As they inspected the corrals and small barn, Harriet found herself imagining a future here, expanding slowly, breeding and training horses, building something sustainable. Thomas walked slightly ahead of her, pointing out features and possibilities, his usual reserve giving way to quiet enthusiasm. "We could add on to the cabin come spring," he was saying. "Another room wouldn't be hard to build." "Another room?" Harriet queried, her cheeks warming. Thomas met her eyes steadily. "For propriety's sake. Unless..." "Unless what?" Her heart raced despite herself. "Unless by spring you'd be willing to consider a more permanent arrangement." His voice was even, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Harriet took a deep breath. 6 weeks ago, she'd been drowning in grief, unable to imagine any future at all. Now, standing in this small clearing with a man she barely knew but somehow trusted, she felt something she'd thought was gone forever: hope. "I can't make promises," she said carefully. "Not yet, but I'm not opposed to the possibility." Thomas's smile was small but genuine. "That's all I'm asking for. Possibility." They bought the ranch that same day, pooling their resources. Thomas would finish the work at Harriet's old place, while she began moving essential items to the new one. They would sell Harriet's ranch to the banker's buyer as agreed, but Bandit would come with them to Medicine Bow. As they rode back, the setting sun painting the mountains gold and crimson, Harriet felt a curious lightness. The grief was still there she suspected it always would be, but it no longer consumed her. In its place was a tentative anticipation, a willingness to see what might unfold. Thomas rode beside her, his presence steady and undemanding. His hands, so gentle with the horses, had begun to rebuild something in her that she'd thought was irreparably broken. Not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with consistency, respect, and quiet understanding. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Thomas glanced over, questioning. "For staying when everyone else left. For seeing what I needed before I knew it myself." "Wasn't hard to see," he replied, his voice soft. "Just needed someone to be patient enough to wait out the storm." The first snow fell 2 days before they were scheduled to move to Medicine Bow. Harriet woke to a world transformed, everything softened by a blanket of white. She found Thomas on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the snowflakes drift lazily from a pearl-gray sky. "Think we can still make the move tomorrow?" she asked, accepting the cup he offered. Thomas nodded. "Snow's not deep. Might be better to go now before more comes." They packed quickly, loading a wagon with Harriet's essential belongings. The banker had agreed to include most of the furniture with the ranch sale, leaving Harriet free to take only what mattered most: her books, her mother's silver, the quilt her grandmother had made. As they prepared to leave, Harriet took one last walk through the house where she'd lived with James. The rooms echoed with memories, but they no longer held her captive. She touched the wooden doorframe where James had marked her height upon their arrival, a silly tradition they'd planned to continue with children who never came. "Ready?" Thomas asked from the yard, Bandit saddled and waiting beside him. Harriet nodded, closing the door without looking back. The future lay before her, as vast and open as the Wyoming sky. The journey to Medicine Bow took most of the day, the wagon moving slowly through the light snow. They arrived at their new home as dusk was falling, the small cabin a dark silhouette against the deepening blue of evening. Thomas lit the lamps while Harriet built a fire in the stone hearth. The cabin was cold but would warm quickly. They worked in companionable silence, unloading only what they needed for the night, seeing to Bandit and the wagon horses before finally settling inside. Harriet sat before the fire, watching the flames dance. Thomas moved around the small space, unpacking provisions, his movements efficient and unhurried. She found comfort in his presence, in the quiet way he occupied space without demanding attention. "It's going to be a good place," Thomas said, sitting beside her on the rough plank floor. "Might be hard at first, but by spring, we'll have it running proper." "I believe you," Harriet replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. Somehow, in the midst of her grief, she'd found faith in this man and his steady hands. Thomas reached into his pocket, withdrawing something small. "Been carrying this for a week now," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Not expecting an answer today, just want you to know my intentions." He opened his palm to reveal a simple silver band, nothing fancy, but well crafted and bright in the firelight. "My mother's," he explained. "When you're ready, if you ever are, it's yours." Harriet stared at the ring, emotion welling up unexpectedly. It wasn't just a ring he was offering, but a future one built on choice rather than necessity, on shared goals rather than desperate need. She closed his fingers around the ring. "Keep it safe," she said softly. "Ask me again in the spring." Thomas nodded, tucking the ring away, but his eyes remained on hers, warm with promise. "Spring it is." As they sat together before the fire, the silence between them was no longer empty, but full of possibility. Harriet's grief hadn't disappeared, but it had changed, transformed into something she could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. And beside her sat a man who understood that transformation, who had witnessed her at her hollowest, and still saw something worth building a future with. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their new beginning with a clean white blanket. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, but for now, they had warmth, shelter, and each other. It was enough. More than enough. Harriet's hand found Thomas's in the firelight, their fingers intertwining naturally. His palm was calloused from years of work, but his touch was gentle as he squeezed her hand in response. No words were needed. Like the horses they both understood so well, they recognized in each other something essential: steadiness, patience, and the courage to begin again. The hollow places grief had carved within her were not gone, but they were no longer empty. Instead, they had become spaces where new feelings could grow, tender shoots reaching towards sunlight after a long winter. Spring would come, as it always did, and with it, perhaps, a different kind of flowering, one built not on passionate promises, but on daily choices to remain, to work together, to create something lasting in a land that forgave no weakness. For now, that possibility was enough to warm the small cabin on a snowy night at the edge of a new frontier, both the one outside their door and the one they were beginning to explore between their cautious hearts.